Of the City of Sonoma Planning Commission for June 14th, 2018. And with that, I'll have the roll call, please.
Commissioner Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner Jansen.
Here.
Chair Felder.
Here.
Commissioner Corrado.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Here. Commissioner
Cribb.
Here. And I would ask Commissioner Corrado if she'd lead us in the pledge. Couple of housekeeping things. Please turn off any of your cell phones or other devices that might make noise during the meeting, and we'd appreciate that. Any decision that's reached by the Planning Commission tonight may be appealed within 15 days to the City Council. If we go pretty long on the discussion items, we have the 10:30 cutoff for any new agenda item, unless it's the will of the council to continue, but we'll see how we do on that one. And with that, this is the opportunity for anybody from the public, if they would care to speak on items not appearing on the agenda, to approach the podium. Please state your name and address, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less.
Patricia Cullinan, 425 Denmark. I think everyone knows why I'm here. I'm president of the Blue Wing Adobe Trust, and this week we went into escrow on the Costa Ignacio Mission Bell Farm. And I would like to announce that to you all and tell you that we're looking to preserve and conserve, put a conservation easement on that property so it will be maintained as a local farmstead forever. So our goal is to raise the money from various sources over the next 6 months to make that happen. And it's a community, it's going to have to be a community effort. And hopefully the city and the Ag and Open Space will help fund that. I really appreciate the support. I noticed on my phone that it's spread all over the internet, so I think that's a good thing. But this is a community effort. We want to keep this as a community resource. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Anyone else care to give public comment for things not on the agenda tonight?
Yes. Okay.
Please state your name and address.
My name is Mark Marthaler, and I'm at 146 East Spain. So I realize that the topic that I just want to briefly bring to the attention of the Planning Commission is not on the agenda today, but it regards the Verizon's 5G rollout of these cell towers. And I'm basically just trying to get my feet wet and understand as much about this topic as possible. And it's a lot to, like, you know, there's a lot of aspects to it, so it's a little overwhelming. But the one thing that I just want to stress to whoever's, you guys and whoever else is in charge with making these important decisions about our community, is the one thing that just seems glaringly obvious is the health part about this technology. And I try to find out, health is very important, and we live in a pretty safe community. And just recently, you guys passed an ordinance or something regarding smoking in public. And that's cool. If we want to go green city and be very proactively, you know, focused on a healthy environment, the 5G technology doesn't seem to be very healthy. And so I looked for whatever I could find that was a positive health scientific study of some kind, and I could not find anything. What I did find was hundreds of studies, scientific, all over, you know, international, that were innocent studies going in looking for results, and they all have negative impact results. And I'm just got to wonder how something like this can actually come into a city and be installed on a, it's a danger to people. I don't have much time to go through things, but there's...
You've only got about 45 seconds left.
Right, so we're talking about technology that is invisible, but has proven evidence, results of studies, evidence for damage to sperm and reproduction, evidence that children are more vulnerable, evidence for effects on autism spectral disorders, evidence of electrohypersensitivity, effects from cell tower level RFR exposure, effects on blood-brain barrier, effects on brain tumors, genes. There's studies that show tumors in rats. We have dogs, we have pets, we have elderly, we have babies. This thing is on a tower 200 feet from a house.
I'll have to ask you to wind it up, please.
It's just...
We hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's why I'm here, just
And
to
I do appreciate your comments.
focus
Thank
on the health aspect. And I just have copies of some regarding Sebastopol and what they did. I
you.
just
You'll
like to leave
give
it.
them over to the...
Okay, great,
staff.
thanks.
Thank
And
you.
it's scheduled to be on next month's agenda?
I think so. I just wanted to, every chance I could get to, or anybody to, it's pretty serious, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question through the chair, just regarding this topic. Could I ask the staff a
Let's
question?
wait till public comments over and then we can ask it. You wanted to ask?
Oh, yeah, I just want to ask staff, just similar to like the Telecommunications Act and cell towers that started popping up and communities having to develop regulations back in the 90s. The federal government, I think it was the FCC, I can't remember, did a series of workshops and presentations for local communities, inviting city planners, public works directors, blah, 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 to educate them and give them information before regulations were developed. So I was wondering if there's any outreach from the FCC, from the state of California to local governments, city managers, to help them look at this.
Well, I guess I would just say that in my own limited experience, it's kind of been up to the local jurisdiction to reach out and find resources and materials related to this matter. I mean, and they're certainly available from the federal government, but at the same time, it's not like they have made any kind of concerted effort to reach out to us either.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak on something not on the agenda tonight?
Not sure if I can speak if I don't live in the city limits.
That's okay, but
Okay.
please state your name. and
Lisa
address.
Murray is my name, and I live at 17189 Valetti Drive. I've come tonight to talk about the 5G and to express my concern about these towers and the science, hundreds of studies that have been done on the effects on the human body. And I think that it just deserves for all of us to really consider what it is that happens and what we don't know about what the technology does before, our Verizon kind of pushes in and puts these things up in front of our homes. They're literally, they are scheduled to be put up right in front of homes, on the sidewalks, where we're all going to be exposed to this technology, which we don't really know what it does beneficially, but we do know what it does that can have negative impact. So I'm here tonight to, again, just voice my concern about it, and I'll be back next month when it's on the agenda as well. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you. Anyone else? Seeing none, I'll close the public comment. Move on to, are there any changes to the agenda or agenda order?
Not from staff.
Okay, so we will move to late correspondence then. late correspondence, David?
We just had a couple of items at your place related to items 7.1, 7.2, and then, of course, just an issues update.
Okay, thank you. With that, we will move on to the next agenda item, which is a public hearing for the application of Brian Larson for an exception to the side yard setback requirements to construct a 182 square foot addition on the property at 373 France Street. With that, I'll ask Wendy to give us a staff report.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the commission. The subject property is a 6,535 square foot parcel located on the south side of France Street, near the corner of France Street and 4th Street West, and it's developed with a single-family residence. The owners are in the process of upgrading the property and are requesting an exception from the side yard setback requirements to construct a 182 square foot master bedroom addition at the back of the residence. The addition would have a length of 19 feet, and it's set back 4 feet 9 inches from the west property line, which represents an increase of 1 foot 3 inches in comparison to the existing building wall. The project would increase the living area of the residence from 2,034 square feet to 2,216 square feet. The proposal is consistent with the general plan. With regard to development code consistency, it's consistent with the development code with the exception of the side yard setbacks. So a 7-foot side yard setback is normally required in this zoning district, and a combined side yard setback must total 18 feet. The project does not comply with this requirement in that the addition would be set back 4 feet 9 inches from the west property line. The combined side yard setback is met. This commission may approve an exception to the development code standards, provided that certain findings can be made, and one is that the adjustment authorized by the exception is consistent with the general plan, and the project is consistent with the general plan. 2, an exception to the normal standards of the development code is justified by environmental features or site conditions, historic development patterns of the property or neighborhood, or the interest in promoting creativity and personal expression in site plan and development. And in part, this exception request relates to site conditions and the historic development pattern of the property and neighborhood. Similar to many parcels on France Street, the property is non-conforming in terms of the minimum lot width requirement. The property has a width of 60 feet versus the current lot width requirement of 65 feet. In addition, 3-foot side yard setbacks are common for homes along France Street, including the adjacent home to the west, as they were constructed in the 1960s prior to the current side yard setback requirements. And 3, granting the exception will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare, or injurious to the properties or improvements in the vicinity in the same zoning district. And the property to the west would be most affected by the project. However, the 4-foot 9-inch setback proposed on the west side of the addition is typical of conditions found throughout the neighborhood and exceeds the setback of the existing home. The bedroom addition on this side has a length of 19 feet, and although windows are proposed on the west elevation, privacy issues will not be an issue, as the windows would face a solid wall on the adjoining property to the west. So for these reasons, staff feels the proposal is generally compatible with neighborhood conditions, including the neighboring property on the west, and would not significantly impact other properties. In the discussion of the project issues, the most significant issue associated with the application is whether the required findings for the proposed setback exception can be made. The proposal complies with all zoning regulations except for the side yard setback requirements, and the property is non-conforming in terms of the minimum lot width requirement. In staff's view, the setback exception is consistent with the site and neighborhood conditions and would not would be generally compatible with the properties in the vicinity, including the adjoining property on the west So therefore, staff recommends the Planning Commission approve the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Questions of staff? Seeing none, I will then open the public hearing. Would the applicant like to step forward and speak to the item?
My name is John Gordon. I'm actually from Santa Rosa at 1204 Melissa Court. And I represent Brian Larson. I'm with Mangentini Construction, and they've come to us to build that addition. And we were the one that kind of spearheaded coming here and trying to get this exemption. So I think the report is very consistent with what we think, and it's very detailed. And I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Has the neighbor to the west agreed that everything is okay?
I personally didn't speak to them, but I understand the Larsons did, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Anyone else from the public here to speak on this item?
Good evening, Planning Commission and staff. I don't have a judgment on this particular project, but it struck me as curious when I was listening to the staff report that that there's the presumption that they have a window, but you're not supposed to be able to see your neighbors. So it's called a neighborhood and not an isolation hood. And just as planning commissioners in a city that's going to perhaps be looking at more infill, it's an interesting conundrum for the Planning Commission if buildings are going to be getting closer together, but windows aren't supposed to be able to look out and see the neighbors, because that's a problem. It seems like there's just kind of a conflict of design and being neighborly. So it was just curious to me as I was listening to the presentation. I came down for another item, but since I have a curious mind, I thought I'd come up and make a comment on the isolation hood aspects of that.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else from the public here to speak on this item? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for discussion and possible action. Anybody want to start?
I'll start. I don't have an issue with this application, especially considering the fact the setback of the addition is greater than most of the existing house, and so I'd be willing to make a motion to approve the item as submitted.
I'll second
that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion?
I just want to say that it's very narrow. I was shocked how narrow that space is between the two, but I too have no problem because of the nature of the addition, but it's narrow.
Oh, I agree. I think it's way too narrow, but the house is existing as a very narrow setback, so it's just sort of an extension of that, in my view.
If there's no further discussion, I will take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
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 So that passes 6-0. Congratulations, you have a project.
Appreciate it.
Moving along to item 7.1, it is an item for discussion. It will be the review, discussion, and recommendations to the City Council regarding options for updated regulations addressing wine tasting facilities. And with that, I believe we'll have a staff report from David.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the Planning Commission. So just as a summary, back in December, the Council adopted an urgency ordinance placing interim restrictions on the establishment of wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. This was done to allow an opportunity for the development and consideration of zoning and other land use regulations pertaining to wine tasting facilities. This direction was taken in light of the growing presence of tasting facilities in the downtown area and the Council's concern that this type of use might be crowding out other types of retail activities. The moratorium is scheduled to end at the end of September of this year, which also represents the target date for the adoption of updated regulations. In the meantime, as directed by the City Council, staff has conducted community outreach and we've researched potential regulatory options. We are now returning to the Planning Commission to review the results of the outreach and research phase and obtain feedback from the Planning Commission on alternative regulatory approaches. The Planning Commission's recommendations will then be reported out to the City Council with the goal of obtaining direction on any new or updated regulations on wine tasting facilities as may be deemed appropriate by the Council. So that's just a quick overview. I would like to go through in a little greater detail some of the points that are discussed in the staff report. Some of this is background information that you're already familiar with, but just so we're clear in terms of what we're talking about, wine tasting facilities and wine bars and tap rooms are uses that are subject to regulation by the State Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, that is the ABC. They license any facility or business involving the sale of alcoholic beverages. The ABC allows a winery, which operates with a Type 2 license, to operate an off-site tasting room under that existing Type 2 license, and that's commonly referred to as a duplicate license. A winery operating with a Class 2 license may only offer its own wines for tasting and for off-site consumption. And this particular type of business is known in Sonoma as a wine tasting facility. Now, in contrast, a wine tasting business that's not associated with a specific winery and that provides tastings from multiple wineries typically obtains a Type 42 license, and that type of business is referred to as a wine bar tap room. And it's important to note that a Type 42 license authorizes the sale of beer and wine for consumption on or off the premises and is not limited just to wine tasting. So in essence, a Type 42 license authorizes a business to operate like a bar or tavern, although limited to sales of beer and wine, although they may, again, self-limit themselves and refer to themselves as a tasting facility. So in Sonoma, tasting rooms, that is the type of business operating under this Class 2 license, have been traditionally regarded as a form of retail sales. And in the commercial zoning district, which encompasses the downtown area, retail sales are a permitted use. So wine tasting facilities as a permitted use are not subject to use permit review, and the city may not become aware of a new facility until it applies for a business license. In contrast, wine bars and tap rooms have been subject to use permit review for many years. Now, there have been previous discussions concerning wine tasting facilities and wine bars and tap rooms, most recently in 2013 and 2014. At that time, the City Council and the Planning Commission held a series of discussions concerning tasting rooms and various options for regulating them. And the Council ultimately decided on establishing updated definitions, establishing operating standards for new wine tasting facilities, including limits on food service, limits on hours, and limits on wine club events. They identified wine tasting facilities as a permitted use in the commercial zoning district, so that was a continuation of previous policy, with a requirement for a use permit review in the mixed use zone. And they identified wine bars and tap rooms as a conditionally permitted use. So these are the existing definitions and regulations that we've just summarized, again, as adopted through the 2013-2014 review. Now, getting back to the current discussion, again, a key action taken by the City Council was to adopt a moratorium on new wine tasting facilities. And this slide identifies the different elements of the moratorium, that is what it regulates and where. It's a prohibition on the approval of new wine tasting facilities. Its geographic area is limited to the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. And there are projects and uses that were not affected by the moratorium, and those include tasting rooms that were already in process. And also exempted from the moratorium is the operation of existing wine tasting facilities. And the operation of an existing use includes potential changes in ownership, as long as there's no expansion or intensification of use. And then in this next slide, we are showing the boundaries of the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, which is a subset of the downtown commercial district. Over the years, the city has contracted with the Chamber of Commerce to provide business development and economic development work on behalf of the city, and as part of that work, they've maintained a database of businesses located within the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, and that database encompasses 138 ground floor commercial tenant spaces. So as you can see, what this overlay zone does not encompass are public uses, such as those on the state parks property. And then in this next slide, we have maps comparing the presence of plaza tasting rooms in 2012 and now in 2018. The inventory identified most recently 33 wine tasting facilities in the downtown area, of which 28 are located in the plaza retail overlay zone. And currently 5 tasting rooms are in locations adjoining the plaza. In comparison, in 2012, there were 13 tasting rooms in the plaza retail overlay zone, with 4 spaces adjoining the plaza. Following the moratorium, the council, or rather I should say in conjunction with the adoption of the moratorium, the council directed staff to perform a number of actions, most notably directions involving public outreach. And as part of that effort, we held a planning commission study session that was done in February 8th of this year. Following that, the city hosted 2 different town hall or resident drop-in meetings. Those were held on Tuesday, April 3rd and Tuesday, April 17th. And those sessions were intended to provide an opportunity for community members to express their views, ask questions, and provide suggestions on the role of wine tasting in downtown Sonoma, and obtain feedback and provide feedback to the city on potential regulatory options. And over the course of those 2 study sessions, approximately 20 persons attended. And we've summarized or highlighted the comments that we received to that in the staff report. In addition, on April 13th, the city and the Chamber of Commerce hosted a meeting of plaza businesses to obtain their feedback. Approximately 35 persons attended that meeting, representing a wide range of plaza businesses, including retail, restaurants, and tasting rooms. So, of course, in the course of these different outreach efforts, we received quite a large diversity of comments, but I think it's fair to say that in the resident drop-ins, the majority sentiment was in favor of additional regulations on wine tasting facilities. In the meeting with plaza businesses, the feedback was quite a bit more mixed in that while there was broad agreement that diversity in business types in the plaza was important, many in attendance opposed regulations that would limit the number of size of tasting rooms, while many others expressed support for the concept, and still others were undecided. And as with the, as is the case with the resident drop-ins, we have the comments from that meeting as well. And many of those who oppose the concept of regulation stress the importance of allowing opportunities for new small business owners to enter the market. On the other hand, others felt that under existing circumstances, small business owners are already at a disadvantage, and that new regulations would not worsen opportunities for this group. And then in addition to these meeting opportunities, staff also consulted with the Chamber of Commerce, representatives of the Sonoma Valley Vintners and Growers Alliance, plaza area property owners, and local commercial real estate brokers. This slide just is intended to highlight something that was addressed in your February 8th study session, and that is that there are in place today different restrictions on downtown business types. Most notably, in 2005, the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone was created. That district was based on a council concern over the proliferation of ground floor office uses in the plaza, especially with respect to real estate offices. And so through this overlay zone, office uses are subject to use permit review, including special findings to support approval of any new office within the plaza retail overlay zone. More recently, in 2012, the council adopted regulations addressing formula businesses. And those regulations, which were developed with the assistance of an ad hoc committee, restrict the introduction of formula business in the downtown area, in that large-scale formula restaurants, that is chains of 250 or more, are prohibited. And a conditional use permit is required for any formula business to be located within the historic overlay zone, including the Plaza Retail Overlay District, with the exception of tenant spaces within specified shopping centers. So that ordinance has come into play a couple of times since its adoption, and we have the example of, in the downtown area, of Mary's by the Slice and Williams Sonoma, which were found to be distinct enough from the main business model of those companies that they were not considered to be formula businesses as defined in the ordinance, and were therefore allowed to enter those tenant spaces. So those ordinances certainly show that local land use regulations can be effective in regulating the composition of downtown businesses, but it is also the case that these ordinances have, by design, already narrowed the range of available options for downtown commercial property owners. In response to Planning Commission direction, we prepared an updated inventory of wine tasting facilities within the downtown planning district. Again, it identifies 33 wine tasting facilities in the downtown area, of which 28 are located in the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. And as requested by the Planning Commission, the updated inventory includes information on the size of the tenant spaces and the ownership of the underlying property, as well as self-reported information on the number of employees associated with each tasting room and the balance of resident and visitor patrons. With regard to area, tenant space sizes range from 323 square feet to more than 6,500 square feet. 15 of the wine tasting facilities are less than 1,000 square feet in area, and the average size is approximately 1,500 square feet. Again, there are 5 tasting rooms that are in locations adjoining the plaza today, and in comparison, in 2012, there were 13 tasting rooms in the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, with 4 in spaces adjoining the plaza, as we saw on those maps previously. So that takes us to the heart of tonight's meeting, which has to do with options for new regulations. In order to develop regulatory options for discussion and consideration, staff has previously surveyed other communities having characteristics similar to Sonoma to learn how they regulate tasting rooms. In addition to the public outreach process, we've received a great deal of feedback and additional suggestions, and the table on the screen now is staff's attempt to summarize the range of options that appear to be most appropriate for Sonoma. So just to go through those, at the top of the list is a use permit requirement. And in staff's view, that represents a baseline change, and that we're recommending that under any scenario, use permit review of new wine tasting facilities be required. The second potential area of regulation has to do with location restrictions. And those could mean a block face separation requirement. It could mean a prohibition on new facilities within the plaza adjoining retail spaces, or both. It could mean a separation requirement even within alley areas. In years past, with some exceptions, such as the former Sonoma Enoteca, which is now Pangloss, wine tasting facilities were often located in smaller tenant spaces and in interior alley areas, such as within Sonoma Court shops. But we're recently seeing wine tasting facilities occupy larger tenant spaces. And these larger, higher profile locations may contribute to the perception that the composition of plaza businesses is becoming increasingly weighted towards tasting room. So location restrictions are one method of addressing that issue. Next on the list would be a tenant space size limit. This could take the form of a maximum limit on the size of the tenant space as a means of limiting the profile and presence of new wine tasting facilities. And we've already talked about the current range of tenants spaces of the facilities that are present today. If there is interest in this option, it will be necessary to determine whether the size limit would apply to the total area of the tenant space or the area of space devoted to retail sales. Next on the list would be a numeric limit. That represents the most direct method of either limiting or prohibiting any increase in the number of wine tasting facilities. Such a limit could take the form of a specific number, possibly equal to or less than the existing number of wine tasting facilities within a defined area. Alternatively, if it were applied to the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, it could be expressed as a percentage of the total ground floor commercial tenant spaces within that zone. Geographic scope is another consideration, and in that regard, we've identified 4 major options. Those being the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, the Downtown Planning District, the Historic Overlay Zone, and citywide. And that scope might be different depending on the area of regulation. As pointed out in the staff report, a numeric limit and location restrictions would be more applicable within a restricted area such as the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, while a use permit requirement could be applied citywide. And lastly, under these regulatory options is the question of grape sourcing. Obviously, it was the increased number of wine tasting facilities that led to the discussion of new regulations, but a secondary issue has emerged, that being the presence or potential for wine tasting facilities representing growing regions outside of Sonoma Valley or Sonoma County to displace local businesses, possibly to the detriment of Sonoma's brand as a wine region. In some communities, grape sourcing requirements have been placed on wine tasting facilities, and we give the example of St. Helena, in which tasting rooms are prohibited from pouring or selling wines that are not made from at least 75% Napa Valley grapes. In researching this issue, staff would just suggest caution and study. Such a requirement would need to be defined very carefully if there is interest in this option. Through our research, we found that many wine producers contract with vineyards both inside and outside of Sonoma Valley, and even outside of Sonoma County. A wine producer may or may not own any vineyard properties, meaning that if a particular supplier were to drop out or become too expensive, it might not be possible for the wine producer to immediately find a substitute supplier within the same region. We also note that such a requirement would involve self-reporting on the part of the winery, and that independently verifying grape sourcing could be time-consuming and expensive in terms of staff resources. As an alternative to a grape sourcing requirement, consideration could be given to addressing this issue through use permit findings, in which the proposed use would need to demonstrate some sort of connection to local agriculture. Before concluding, I do want to just emphasize something. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of how many new regulations would affect existing wine tasting facilities. In essence, if the city establishes a conditional use permit requirement for new wine tasting facilities, existing tasting rooms would be considered to be legal non-conforming. That means that, in essence, it would be considered to be grandfathered and would not be subject to any new permitting requirements except upon the loss of their legal non-conforming status or the existence of other extenuating circumstances. There might be some very limited exceptions to that, but so far, and we've held extensive discussions with the city attorney's office on this issue, it really appears to be the case that they would simply not be subject to the new regulations that are under consideration at this time. This means that one tasting room business may replace another at a grandfathered location, as long as there is no intensification of the original use. Therefore, if new regulations are adopted, it's likely that the current number of tasting rooms will remain stable, at least in the short term. Staff would also note that to the extent that there remains a strong demand to establish wine tasting rooms, the use permit requirement and a numeric limit, if adopted, could have the effect of increasing the value of existing grandfathered wine tasting tenant spaces, which could ultimately result in limiting opportunities for newcomers and small businesses, at least in the short term. And as we've seen over the years, however, I would also point out there's a cyclical nature to business composition in downtown Sonoma, just as there is within the state, just as there is within the country as economic forces change, new uses become more competitive, existing uses become less competitive. We have all seen that happen here, and if new regulations are adopted on wine tasting facilities that limit their number over the long term, we believe that that would have an effect of reducing the number of wine tasting facilities. So we're here tonight, again, seeking comments and recommendations from the Planning Commission concerning new or expanded regulations on wine tasting facilities. These recommendations will be reported out to the Council with the goal of obtaining direction to be used in developing an ordinance that would establish these updated regulations. We're not necessarily tonight looking for the Planning Commission to reach consensus on some comprehensive framework of regulation. If we end up simply reporting out comments of individual planning commissioners, that's okay. On the other hand, if a consensus does emerge in different areas, that's great too. We will take whatever direction we get from the planning commission, and we will move it on to the council. And that's what we're here for tonight, and with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Questions of staff? Let's keep it limited to questions at this point until we have public comment.
I've got, and it goes to your legal non-conforming, and I guess I need, hold on. That was in your 2004 memo, I believe, that you made that comment originally. And I read it, and I don't understand it. And I'm going to admit it right here and now. And I'm asking this question about the legal non-conforming use. What constitutes a loss of status? What happens if, about the grandfathering? And I just want to know what's in your head about why you think it's it can be limiting to the, because I'm leaning towards a numeric limit, and I'm concerned about that thought process.
Well, I'm going to give you a simple answer, and then the city attorney will give you the correct answer.
Okay.
So we'll take it one step at a time. First, we're talking about existing businesses in Sonoma that were established legally. So in the phrase or term legal non-conforming use, they're a use. They were established legally. Right now, they're operating in conformance with established regulations, in the sense that there is no use permit requirement for wine tasting facilities in the downtown area. All they needed to do was get a business license. In most cases, there are exceptions to that. There are some that actually did get a use permit for one element of their use or another, particularly those adjoining residential zoning districts. So again, we're talking about a use that is legal and today conforming. Now, what if the Planning Commission and City Council adopt regulations that establish a use permit requirement for wine tasting facilities? Well, those legal facilities won't have a use permit. They will not have met that requirement, so they will be non-conforming. But they're legal, they remain legal because they were established legally. And the creation of this new permitting requirement does not undercut or diminish the fact that they were established legally. Their non-conforming status does have certain implications and basically resulting in restrictions on what can happen with such uses, but they were established legally, and that's not taken away by a use permit requirement. So as a legally established business, they may continue to operate as established, meaning same number of seats, hours of operation, same level of intensity as when they were legally established. Now, if they wish to add seats, then the use permit requirement gets triggered because that's an intensification of the use. But if they were to simply change ownership, in which there's no intensification of use, the city has no authority to get in the way of that or interfere with that change of ownership, and the city has no authority simply by virtue of change of ownership to impose new requirements or restrictions. That can only happen with an intensification of the use, or if the use were to, for example, violate its ABC permit. That might call into question the validity of the use. But at this point, I'm reaching the end of my thin ice, and I'm going to turn it over to Veronica.
Thanks, David. I think, thanks anyway. So legal non-conforming use, how you establish it, how you lose that status, has a long line of cases in California, both at the California appellate level as well as in the Supreme Court, both of the state of California and of the United States. As you can imagine, this is an issue that's been litigated pretty far into the ground, no pun intended, in terms of whether or not existing legal businesses can continue to operate in the face of regulations that would otherwise affect a new business coming in with the exact same circumstances. In general, both as set forth in the city's ordinance as well as under state law, a legally established building business, as David, or a building for that matter, as David previously indicated, can continue to exist. There are some limited instances where you can affect their operation. Much of those issues had to do with essentially allowing the business sufficient time to recoup its investment. So most of these cases arise out of takings law, which essentially says that if a governmental agency, through actual destruction of someone's private property or through regulation, affects a taking of someone's private property, that action requires just compensation. And that arises out of both the federal and in California state constitutions. What occurs in most of these cases are a question of at what point does applying regulation constitute a taking. The cases where exceptions have been raised over the course of a number of years initially started out with billboard cases. So if, 30 years ago, maybe give or take, there was a push to get billboards out of private property and the right-of-way. The proliferation of them had been sort of a visual blight. Cities started coming forward to adopt regulations to say you just can't have them here, take them down. Through a series of legislative actions as well as case law interpreting those actions, there became a process by which those billboards could amortize over a number of years. It was fairly easy to determine amortization periods for those because they all roughly cost about the same amount to construct and have the same sort of materials, et cetera, going up. There is an ability in some circumstances to amortize uses, but it becomes a very long period of time generally and rather expensive, if you will. It also becomes difficult to track over time. Our ordinance does not provide, our non-conforming ordinance currently in this jurisdiction does not provide any period of time under which an existing business or structure has to come into conformity. It essentially says if you were legal and existing at the time that you, as David mentioned, established, you may continue to operate in the same manner and under the same circumstances as you previously operated, with the exception of the fact that if you abandon that use, cease for a period of time, then that's it. So if, for instance, you came up with a numeric limit in this instance, and I'll try to apply it more to what we're talking about here, and you said, we want no more than, pick a number, 25, I'm just making this number up, it's not a suggestion, I just want to be clear, 25 wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Overlay District. Let's say that's what you decided you wanted to do. Then there already are more than 25, as we're obviously aware, which would mean that no new could establish under your ordinance. And if you did not try to do an amortization of those uses, what would ultimately occur, and I don't know how you would apply that, and I'll explain that in a minute. What would ultimately occur would be that as the businesses went out of business or failed to continue, a new one would not be able to establish once they pass that threshold of time of abandonment of the use. So they would over time, maybe or maybe not, market depending, let's be clear, diminish, and you'd get down to that 20 number and or 25 number, and let's say you finally got to 24, then somebody new could apply for that new one permit that would be left under the numeric number. It would be difficult to make a determination of amortization in this context because they're all so different. If you can appreciate it, the amount of time for a business like, I don't know, what's the biggest one, Pangloss? Is that the biggest? Okay, so let's just assume that business. The largest, maybe with the most tenant improvements to recoup their investment would be far greater than a tiny closet-shaped business in the middle of downtown that didn't have much investment and really set up a few tables and some wallpaper and bathroom improvements or what have you. So I don't think this lends itself easily to that kind of an amortization, but I think that if the commission and council ultimately want to look at limiting the number or reducing the number, having them by what we would normally say attrition disappear and reach that threshold, I don't think is a problem whatsoever.
What would constitute abandonment, though?
1 year.
So under our ordinance, under the city's current ordinance, it's 1 year of operation, ceasing to operate, ceasing to exist for a year. Oftentimes the automatic time period is disfavored in the law, and there are a couple of kind of unpleasant cases out there where somebody came in, a year and a month afterward, or tried to expand a use after it was non-conforming through a permit process. But in general, a year now. That does not mean that you cannot modify that year-long period, however. I don't think 30 days would probably fly in the face of the law, and we'd have to research what that window, if the commission and council are interested in, how long or short can that window be. I think we'd want to do some additional research into what's the shortest that's been upheld by a court.
But we do have a year on the books right now.
You have a year on the books right now.
Can I just ask a follow-up? I know you want to ask a question. All right, so understanding. So if we say 25, there's 33. Some of those go away.
Maybe.
Right? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
But whatever, we have them. And we go down to 25 and 24. And we're just doing a numeric. We're not tied to location. So could wine tasting A move to another location?
No. No. The establishment of a use is specific to the and we would make this clear in whatever ordinance you adopt, but it's specific to the location at which it establishes. Land use and land use entitlements run with the land, not the business. So an establishment at 101 First Street, I'm making up addresses, I don't even know if there is one there, at 101 First Street East is legal and non-conforming at 101 First Street East. It can't pick up and go to 207 First Street West.
But that's if there's a use permit.
No, that's regardless.
Okay. So talking about grandfathering means that another wine tasting facility would go into that location.
They could
Within a year.
within a year, but that location can't pick up and move to a location where one hasn't previously existed.
All right. But you can grandfather it in and another winery can come in. So whatever, if we decide on a numeric, I'm using my hands again. If we decide on a numeric, so what is where they are, that's it, right?
Where they are, what they are, and how big they are.
Is it.
So, an example, they wouldn't be able to, let's just, for the sake of argument, say they're in a tenant space where walls can be moved by tenant improvements. And they say, all right, well, we're here, but we want to be bigger now. We want to go into the suite next to us. They would have to get, assuming you imposed a use permit requirement, they'd have to get the use permit to expand their size. And you can, with your regulations, make a determination as to whether or not you want existing businesses to be able to expand with a use permit, or if you don't want them to be able to expand with a use permit. And that can be part of the regulations we establish.
Well, my question's is a follow-up to this topic. I have a few questions, but specifically about what we've been discussing. When we were discussing cannabis policy recently, there was an option to do a use permit or a license permit that only runs with the business, not with the land. And I'm curious if that is possible for wine tasting, because I don't like something that in general runs with the land if there is a cap, because it sort of artificially inflates the value of the ones that currently exist. And so it would be nice if there was a licensing permit that could just run with the business. And I'm just curious, are those only, we can't retroactively require that?
Right, that's true.
So A, and then
So
going
A-
forward, what could we offer that instead of a use permit?
You'd still set it, well, I'm not sure you could, and I'm not sure a license has any way of establishing a land use in light of California law. Having said that, it establishes a right of someone to do something. So, I'm trying to look
I
at
only
it.
ask it because it seemed to be an option for cannabis policy, and so I'm wondering why it's not an option for this.
Well, right now you already have wine tasting facilities as an established land use category. So you've got this weird situation where you've already established it as a specific land use. And to try to insert a different regulatory scheme on top of it probably just puts you in the same boat. You could limit the number of licenses you have, but then you'd be saying the land use itself, though it might require some other type of license, like a license to sell liquor or whatever it would be, which is probably preempted, by the way, in this instance. But whatever other license, you'd still have the situation where you'd have land use requirements that would be separate and applicable to all these other people, and then license requirements. I don't know how you'd even do it, because your land use requirement, right now you don't have one. So if you don't establish one, you don't turn these existings into non-conforming uses at all. You may apply a licensing scheme requirement that says, all right, like I'll use massage as an example. We've said some years ago, massage establishments, the person operating has to have a license, but they also have to be in the right land use category, and the operation has to have a license. So they have 3 layers. We could add a layer, but I wouldn't recommend we take away the idea of establishing or dealing with the location as well, if that makes sense.
It does. And then related to this, and maybe it's not, and that's why I'm asking the question, a few years ago I believe we banned cigarette sales in Sonoma, and existing shops had
A tobacco retailer's license.
so it was a license situation. So there's no comparison or similar potential. And again, that's not what I want to do. I'm just saying.
I
know
totally
that-
get it, and
yeah, there
I
are
understand where you're going.
like 10
You don't
years
want to
out,
establish,
right.
you prefer not to, with the use permit requirement, I mean, the good, on the plus side, you get to evaluate them on their merits, on their location, all of those things. But on the flip side, once you've approved that use permit, it runs with the land. And I understand, why there might be a caution about wanting to go down that road, or to at least look at different options. But a tobacco retailer's license, selling cigarettes isn't really a land use. It's a subset of the of a retail operation. That's the difference, and that's the difference with our music license too. You can't just get a music license and be a business. You have to already be a business in a land use to get a music license.
And I think that really speaks to that question of do we want to do 2 layers versus 1? A tobacco retailer, depending on where they may be, might also have a land use entitlement permit to be in the location that they're in and be retail. Although I think probably any place retail's allowed, it's allowed by right. But assuming for the sake of argument, if it weren't allowed by right and required a use permit, they'd have a use permit and a retailer license. The use permit would cover all of their activity. The retailer license would say, yes, you can sell tobacco from this location. They could lose one and still be a business, where wine tasting pretty much is the business. Although I suppose they could still sell at retail wine in box, like a retail business of just selling bottled wine for consumption off premise. So maybe it works in terms of the pouring portion of it. And I think we could do it as a two-tier, but I still don't think I would want to take the land use issue away. You might be able to split apart as and I'm thinking out loud, and I haven't really researched this.
If we don't define land use, doesn't that give us more flexibility? Didn't you say like?
But you already have it defined. It already
Because
is a use
it's
category.
a permitted use and.
Right, it's listed as a permitted use, right.
I just have one question, and I just want just clarification, because it doesn't prevent somebody from, in an office situation, having a wholesale, a resale license to, for example, sell wine on property with, as long as there's no consumption of it. Say, for example, you're a wine broker and you have an office on a second floor building, and
This is only about Class 2 wine tasting facilities. This discussion is not directed at all in terms of wholesaling, and you can do that in a variety of locations, and it's just simply not something that's going to be affected by rules that are adopted in this context.
So it's only for consumption?
It's for Class 2 wine tasting facilities, so yeah.
It's a combination of consumption and sale would be allowed under those circumstances. And I don't know right now whether or not I'd have to pull a code to look at whether or not one could actually, from a strictly office use, do on-site sale of anything. I'm not sure you can.
Oh, not, I was talking about wholesaling, not retailing. Yeah.
Right, so you could arrange for a sale that takes place as a point of sale elsewhere or wherever,
Right.
but you wouldn't, that would be an electronic transaction from an office.
Right, you would be buying and selling wine as a wine broker. The point of sale would be in the city of Sonoma. The sales tax would be collected here, but there wouldn't necessarily be any prohibition of selling it as long as there's no consumption.
Well, no consumption and no delivery. You wouldn't necessarily be able to warehouse it in your office and have someone come in and take delivery of that wine out of an office setting. That's not office, that's retail.
Well, I think the bottom line is it's just a totally separate issue, that it's not going to be affected by anything you do with this item.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Veronica? Location restrictions. So let's say that is the prevailing direction. And we specify, a block face separation. What happens to the legal, non-conforming, existing wine tastings?
So that one's very interesting. Generally speaking, how that would work would be, and this requires almost graphing, but I'll try to do it if you can visualize. So let's say you said 1 per block face. That's your separation requirement. There can be 1 on each block face within, and you define the geographic area. And 2 already exist. The 2 can stay because they're legal non-conforming. The new regulation does not apply to them. But a 3rd would not be able to come in and get a permit on that block face because they're already exceeding your 1 number. They'd have to go find a block face that did not already have 1 in it. If 1 legal non-conforming existed and you established your regulation is 2 per block face, 1 more permit could get issued for that block face, but until one of those 2 businesses went out of business, a 3rd could not be issued. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First of all, so basically, as I understand it, we currently this is a permitted use, it's a wine tasting, okay? And we're going to possibly go to a use permit, and this is part of the many sort of proposals, correct? All right? So what happens with those that are existing? They'll become legal non-conforming uses, okay? What happens to applications that are outstanding? We have two that I know of, at least, okay, that came before the commission and were held in abeyance pending, I think, these regulations and what we might do.
Well, we have one application that has been paused, even though it is not within the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. So that can actually move forward for consideration at any time because the moratorium only applies to the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. We had another application that was made prior to the adoption of the moratorium, but that was not heard or acted upon and during the time that the moratorium was adopted. And we have advised the applicant that that application does need to be put on hold until the moratorium expires.
But what would be the status, basically, legally, okay, for them to, okay, my understanding is that both of those applications.
Well, let's not talk about a particular application. Let's just say after this, once we have new regulations in place, and say hypothetically that there's a use permit requirement, then any of these existing non-conforming uses could apply potentially for a use permit to, I don't know, get bigger, add some seats. But you would review that, and it would be up to you to decide whether or not that was appropriate.
So if they were legally non-conforming and they didn't have a use permit and they wanted to do something slightly different on their property, okay, then would they have to reapply for a total use permit?
If the slightly different is an expansion, yes.
In other words, outdoor seating would be an expansion,
Yes.
for example? Okay, all right, I think I have another question here. Okay, that's it, thank you.
If I don't see any more questions, I'm going to open it up to public comment. Have at it.
Good evening, Planning Commission and staff. I've been interested in this wine tasting on the plaza issue since it came out a number of years ago, and I remember at that time that the use permit was the item that was at most contention, and the wine industry and wine advocates didn't want a use permit, and the people who wanted to limit it wanted a use permit. So I think that it's great now that staff is recommending a use permit. And personally, I would be for that and recommend that you go for the most restrictive options possible. As I recall, the rationales before that allowed the wine tasting to expand to the level they are now was to let the free market take care of it. That's what the bulk of the city council and the planning commissioners' rationales were for letting things go from the way they were to the way they are now. So now we got a moratorium from the city council in the short term because I guess things got a little bit too big. So I think personally it's a larger issue that calls for a systemic solution. It's not just wine tasting on the plaza, it's the whole monoculture tourism economy that needs to be addressed, but this is sort of a way into it. This is a link that you're able to provide some controls on that. As I don't think a monoculture economy is adaptive, and as that we can consciously create the society and have regulations and parameters to shape society the way that we want it. And so in that regard, some are against regulation, but I don't think that it's regulation per se that people are against, because many of the people who advocate no regulation then come out and want to regulate cannabis or a woman's reproductive rights. So I don't think that it's really an issue of regulation. It's really just a value judgment of what you want or not. And so regulation is just another value judgment. So I think that, you can look at the whole situation as wine hospitality tourism has raised the rents on the plaza corporate wine has come in, raised the rents, plaza landlords have raised the rents. And so the moratorium is an opportunity to put a brake on landlords raising the rent so much and give the city council an opportunity to maybe put an ordinance where they could fine landlords for leaving buildings vacant, and that therefore would help to have a more diverse economy because it would open up more storefronts away from wine things. So you have to start somewhere to shape the society that we would like to have, and I think that having a wine tasting moratorium goes right along with the council limiting real estate, limiting formula stores, and it fits right in with shaping the type of society that we would like here, which is just a little bit more diverse and a little bit more equitable rent-wise. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Jeff Spelly, and I'm going to speak on behalf of the Sonoma Valley Vintners and Growers. And we would just like to start by saying we appreciate the fact that we've been a part of this discussion. So the wine has been a part of Sonoma's history for over 150 years, and we've evolved with the city. We started as farmers who sold their grapes to a few wineries, and then we evolved again to estate owners who made their wines and also sold their own wines. And then recently, we've evolved as wholesalers consolidated and sold wines to direct to guests and people who live across the country. And each time we've evolved, we've met the changing economy, and we've provided more economic success to the city and our citizens. So as businesses left the plaza and citizens shaped their own futures with Safeway, Lucky, Friedman's, Whole Foods, we moved and we took those businesses and we provided a sound business and growth for our economy. So we employ 54,000 people in Sonoma County alone, and we provide $13.4 billion in local county economic revenue. We're 85% family owned. $30 million of that economic revenue came to local nonprofits within the Sonoma Valley. So I think as citizens get interested in things and as things change, I think that it's important for us to ask ourselves, how can we help these businesses evolve? And I think that's the question that the Sonoma Valley Vintners and Growers has been trying to solve. We know we need to help all businesses, and government has the responsibility to help our retail neighbors and to evolve as businesses consolidate to online and large retail stores. And as they move, those stores move outside the plaza, we want to help them evolve. We want to help them promote and grow in the same way that we've evolved. So we as an industry believe that our membership body believes that there is more common ground in our priorities and the proponents of regulations admit, and we look forward to discussing these ideas in ways that improve the entire community as we fit into the 100-year business plan of the Sonoma Plaza. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Patricia Cullinan. I wasn't going to talk on this subject, but it just came to mind when people were talking about a proliferation of real estate offices. It's very different to have a proliferation of real estate offices where a diverse group of people can walk around the plaza with their kids and look at the signs in the windows versus alcohol purveyors. It's just, I think that that's one thing that you need to look at as a group, that it's a different kind of business and it sets a different kind of tone for the whole community. And also, I did have a question through the chair. I know that you were talking at one time about the amount of tax that, well, let me think here. So a lot of the businesses, the wine businesses, are getting money getting members for their wine clubs, and that money does not come to Sonoma. At one time, didn't the city look at that as to figure that out, to see, what the advantage of having the wine tasting facilities where they were really getting customers for other locations, for the taxes going into other locations?
I think we'll, if that's all you're going to have,
Yeah.
Patricia will address that. David?
Sure. The issue of sales tax collection is something that the city has looked at and examined pretty closely. There are just different rules that apply depending on how the origin of the sale is defined. And so there are certainly cases where, you know, certain sales that occur through a wine tasting facility aren't taxed in a manner that particularly benefits the city. But that said, when we look at wine tasting facilities as a whole, in terms of their sales tax contribution, it's reasonably comparable to other kinds of retail uses. And like other kinds of retail uses, within that category of wine tasting facilities, I mean, there are some that don't produce much at all, and there are some that produce a lot. So there's just a wide variation. At least from what I have seen, again, it appears to be generally comparable with other kinds of retail sales. And in any event, while it's a good question, it's not a land use issue.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Seeing none, I'm going to bring it back to the commission for discussion. Who wants to start?
I'll start. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think this is an important issue, and my first recommendation to the City Council, so I don't know how we're going to do this, if we're going to come to consensus or if you're going to give individual commissioner comments, is that we extend the moratorium. I believe that we can do that for up to 2 years total. So I would personally recommend extending it through September 30th, 2019. And the reason I say that is because I think this is, again, a really important issue, and I think we really should think hard about it. And I would like this actual conversation and process to go in a similar fashion, in my view, to the way the cannabis process has gone. There have been like 2 cannabis town halls at the community center. There were consultants brought in. I think this is an issue that would benefit from that. I really liked one of the comments that was in the staff report from community outreach meeting with Plaza Businesses, where it says we need a development plan for the square. We need to find a way to bring more retail establishments to the square. And I think what that means is we need a sort of economic development plan for Sonoma. And that is going to involve, I think, working with the Chamber of Commerce and the Visitors Bureau and consultants. And I know the city likes to hire them. And so I think this is actually a good issue to hire a consultant for. I personally think, and I don't think I'm wrong, that people in town care more about tasting rooms than cannabis. And there's like no one here tonight. And I think that that's certainly was not the case 5 years ago when a previous commission handled this issue. And I think there are various reasons for that. It wasn't in any newspaper. I don't think I don't think there was as much public awareness for this meeting. And so I would hate to rush this process along without a lot of public input. And I know that we have done public input in terms of the drop-in, but I think we need to think a little differently about this. So in general, those are my comments about the process. Specifically about the different items here on the screen, again, part of the reason why I want the process to continue is because I struggle with the use permit requirement, because my goal ultimately, and I think the goal of every Sonoman, is to have a diverse mix of businesses on the plaza that locals like to go to and that visitors like to visit. And I feel like that balance has been out of whack recently. And so I worry that when it comes to use permits, as I discussed, I don't want to artificially inflate the value of a non-conforming grandfathered use. And I want to explore options there. I also worry, quite frankly, about use permits in general, because that really requires the Planning Commission to weigh in. And as you can tell, I've not agreed with all of our decisions recently. And so if we're just going to install another layer of bureaucracy, where every time a tasting room comes before and it just gets approved anyway, I don't think there's a point for it. In terms of a numeric limit, I am again open to discussing that. I hate to put an artificial limit on that, but again, I think we're here because something isn't working. Even at our last meeting, the Taub Family Outpost that's opening the new restaurant on the corner, I believe he said something to the effect that the tasting room market is saturated, and that's why he wanted to explore different options. So perhaps the market will self-regulate this, but up until now it certainly hasn't. Location restrictions and geographic scope. I mean, I'm open to hearing other arguments from the commission. I would have liked to hear more, public input on some of these. The grape sourcing requirement is very interesting to me, because I think that should just go without saying that they should be Sonoma County wines, yet it seems to, from the staff report and just from what I know about the industry, opens up a can of worms. And so what I would love is to have a larger process, bring in some economic development consultants. We don't want to create a situation where perhaps the market is saturated, but let's say it's not and it continues to grow, and 5 years from now we've got 50 tasting rooms. Visitors, and as much as that bothers locals, because they can't, they're losing more and more places on the plaza to visit in their own town, I don't think tourists like this. I think tourists want to go to an authentic small town that has a mix of diverse establishments on the plaza. And from just anecdotally, I know that I know people that have visited here and just thought, how many tasting rooms can you go to? And so if Sonoma, if our downtown is something we are going to market to the world, because I feel like that's what we've decided, that's what our economy is, we need to really market something that tourists like, and I don't know, quite frankly, if they like, maybe they are interested in other things besides tasting rooms. And because of the changes in the industry, and because for many this is their only path to market, and because it doubles in some of these tasting rooms as a marketing expense, it isn't potentially as artificially inflated rents on the plaza. And these are very difficult issues, and so that's why I would support extending the moratorium and really treating this process as part of, and perhaps it'll be in the general plan anyway, but as part, in a similar fashion to the way we've treated the cannabis regulations. And I'm open to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Through the chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
I did just want to comment on the general plan aspect of it a little bit, just to provide the commission with some background. It's intended, and I think that this has previously been reported to the Planning Commission, and I believe we even talked about this at the February 8th meeting, that it is going to be a component of the general plan update to develop an economic development strategy with an emphasis on the downtown. So that is going to be a piece of the general plan update. That said, as has been pointed out, while there's an opportunity to extend the moratorium for some period of time, even possibly as long as another year, it's going to take longer than a year to develop an economic development strategy for the downtown. And in the meantime, the moratorium does place, at least to some extent, a cloud of uncertainty on existing tasting rooms, and we have direction from the council to move forward in developing these regulations. So your comments are your comments, and certainly all planning commission comments, and if this turned out to be a planning commission consensus, will be forwarded to the city council for their consideration. But I just would like to emphasize that from a staff perspective, while it's certainly possible to lengthen this process and have additional opportunities for public outreach, this review is not going to be a substitute for the other task of developing this larger economic development strategy.
I just want to jump in, Commissioner Barnett. I would solicit individual comments from each of the commissioners, and hopefully as we go through and hear the individual comments, there might be some consensus that'll come of it. But I'd rather let everybody have their personal say, and then we'll see where we go.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank staff for the comprehensive staff report, and it was very helpful in me being able to digest the history and also the task at hand. And I'm just going to get right down to kind of my feelings about the land use itself. I think that based on the type of use, the type of product that's sold and consumed, the potential for land use conflict between uses, I think that a use permit is something that seems reasonable and something that we should probably require for wine tasting facilities. So I would be supportive of that. Just jumping right into geographic scope, I think that this is something that we should look at on a citywide basis for all commercial zoning or any zoning that would accommodate this type of a commercial type of activity or retail activity. And the reason why I say that is because we have to be cognizant of if this is a popular type of use, we have to be cognizant of what sort of uses might get knocked out in other areas of the city besides the plaza for wine tasting facilities. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I would like to see us review a wine tasting facility if it were to pop up as a proposed use next to, say, Sonoma Market or next to Safeway or somewhere along Broadway where it was a busy street that had an appropriate zone. So I think that we should be looking at these on a case-by-case basis. So I would support a citywide geographic scope, and we could figure and hone on the zoning districts where that would be relevant. The location restrictions are intriguing. Block face separation requirements, new facilities within specifically the plaza, no facilities within the plaza. And they seem to make sense, but sometimes they can be convoluted. And I'd like the commission's thoughts about how instead of like creating location restrictions, we create specific findings that tie kind of these location considerations in, as opposed to just saying that you can't have more than 3 uses on First Street West, instead of saying that, we could actually develop either guidelines or findings in terms of concentration and separation and compatibility, and letting the commission make the findings or not make the findings to approve a use permit. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from. With respect to location restrictions. In terms of tenant space sizes, again, I think looking at findings, looking at compatibility, looking at the relevance of the space. In some instances, a 300 square foot tasting facility may not make any sense, whereas a 2,000 square foot one may make sense, and vice versa. So, and I think a lot of it has to do on the specific location that's being proposed. So again, I'd like to take a more simplistic approach and look at like developing and honing in on developing findings that staff can develop, that the council can approve in terms of what we as a commission would be responsible for making. The numeric limits also are intriguing, particularly like saying no more than 25 on the plaza. Again, I think if we are very careful and pragmatic about developing findings, and we do have a use permit process that is citywide, I think, and we have like specific findings about concentration and grouping, that the numeric limit itself may be redundant. Now, with respect to geographic scope, the plaza retail overlay is much more sensitive than citywide. Like I had mentioned, I thought that we should have a use permit for the whole city. But in terms of the geographic scope, I believe that similar to the tap rooms, I think that we could focus on more specific language for the plaza overlay as it relates to concentration, as it relates to compatibility. So we may have to meet more specific findings for those tasting facilities that apply within that overlay, if that makes sense to the commission. And then with respect to grape sourcing requirements, I read so much literature, other cities requiring that, but there's also the downside in terms of enforcing it. And so I don't know how we would create a wine police in the city of Sonoma that would go to each one of these facilities. I think that Commissioner Barnett made an interesting comment about sourcing, and so maybe there might be a way for us to put together a sourcing requirement, some guidelines, and also when a proposal comes before us, they would make a commitment, and then we could make those findings, and that like we've done in other instances where we've had people that have applied for use permit have committed to doing something, and then those were included in the conditions of approval and the findings that we made. But just in summary, I really believe that we need a use permit process for this. I agree with Commissioner Barnett that we need to take time in doing this, and I'm not saying that we should extend the moratorium to 2019, but I also feel strongly that if it's going to take us longer than September to get this right and to possibly create guidelines or findings, and it may take us 4 or 6 months longer, I think it's reasonable to ask for the extension of a moratorium.
Oh, absolutely.
To do that.
I don't want to give that impression either. September 30th is an objective, but it's not a drop dead date. If we need to take more time, we certainly can.
Yeah. So, I feel that would be appropriate. So, anyway, I'm looking forward to what my other commissioners have to say.
Can I jump back in real quick? Just If a moratorium can't be extended, because as David says, this is city council direction, they want a decision by September 30th. Another option to basically, practically the same as a moratorium would be to recommend a numeric limit less than the existing number of tasting rooms with a use permit process, thinking that we're not going to really have to deal with it for the next, let's say it's 25 and they're currently 35. I don't think there will be, well, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but that will give us time to get that economic study from the general plan and really take our time with it, and then potentially recalibrate that after maybe we have more information. So that's just an alternative to basically have a moratorium without having a moratorium.
That also seems reasonable, because we can always make changes in the future. We can try something out, and if it doesn't work, we can always modify the code. So that's a good point as well.
Well, I too will add my thanks to staff's report and the public's input. Like Commissioner Barnett, I'd hope to see more people here this evening, though I do know that we got a fair amount of input from the sort of community outreach that was done before. I think the place that I kind of want to start is I think we're actually talking about two different issues here, and I think that's part of what Commissioner Barnett alluded to. I mean, because there's tasting rooms and then there's an overall economic plan, and I don't think they're as closely tied as people are making them out to be, in my estimation. So I kind of wanted to start with what I think are some of the myths, if you will, surrounding tasting rooms. And one is that, and it was even in the staff report, and talking about City Council's direction, that tasting rooms were crowding out other uses or displacing local businesses. Well, the fact of the matter is that's not true. There are larger economic forces that have moved commodity-based businesses out of the plaza over the years, and other types of businesses. You know, the Petersons used to have a jewelry shop on the plaza, and then the Marketplace Shopping Center opened, and it was a better rent, and they felt a better location, and so they moved their jewelry business. And then the jewelry store that's next to where Sweet Scoops is, since the Petersons are retiring, they're relocating their jewelry store to where the Petersons were in the shopping center. So people are making choices. They're not being, a winery didn't come in and say, you need to get out of the space. A tenant didn't, or a landlord didn't say, I'm not going to rent to you again. I mean, so I think to sort of have that construct, I think, is a little false. I think, in fact, what's really happened is that in a lot of cases, tasting rooms have come in and filled voids where other types of commerce is no longer practical. Also, this idea that wine tasting facilities are strictly for tourists. Again, I think it's been pointed out, a lot of these businesses, they are direct to consumer. So they co-ferment somewhere. They don't have a winery. You can't go someplace and buy the wine other than visiting their location that's on the plaza. So, and the data that we've been provided in the staff report shows that most of these tasting facilities have a fairly large percentage of their clientele are locals. So it's not just a tourist-only kind of business. It's also local serving kind of business. And then this idea that there are too many tasting rooms. Well, I mean, and this issue we could probably debate and ad infinitum, but I think right now it's 20%. So 4 other businesses exist for every tasting room. And our numbers don't include the state park. And so if you look at the sort of, to me, the consumer experience of being on the plaza, about 25% of the ground level sort of pedestrian experience that you have if you're walking around the plaza is a state park. So we're talking actually about 20% of 75% of the sort of remaining space. So that doesn't seem to me to be an overwhelmingly large amount of business. And the other thing, and I just want to, I was kind of wondering about because I've heard in discussions with other people and even some of my own friends who've talked about there being sort of too much tasting rooms, but I said, well, I'm just going to go out and see what the internet has to say. So I went out to TripAdvisor, to Yelp, and did Sonoma Plaza. And in both cases, our plaza got about a 4.5 out of 5-star type rating. And I've got TripAdvisor up here in front of me right now. There are over 700, almost 800 reviews. And of those, 455 rate our plaza as excellent, 257 is very good, and 4 as terrible, and 6 is poor. And
They went to City Hall.
and I just read through I went through pages of the reviews, and here's some of just the headlines: sweet, historical, don't miss out. Sonoma Square, walk about. The square is the great place to go. There are numerous great restaurants, specialty shops. Very rarely was there anyone saying, even, wine was buried in those discussions, but it wasn't the main thing. And I had to go like 6 pages deep before I got the first negative review. And it wasn't about there were too many tasting rooms. So.
Was it about parking?
Actually, a lot of people talked about free parking. And many people said, well, you might have to circle around a couple times, but you'll find a parking space. But I would just encourage people to go out and look and see how does the world view what we just take for granted is kind of our own backyard. So also that tasting rooms are driving up the rents. Landlords are driving up the rents. As was pointed out by the representative from the Vintners and Growers, 85% of the wineries here are family-owned businesses. These are not deep-pocketed large corporations who are just willing to pay any price. I think it's a robust economy, and the fact that things have gotten tighter with the economic rebound. So I don't think you can blame increasing rents on the wine business. And I totally agree, because it's just sort of a fact of life in all ecosystems. Diversity is necessary. And I was glad to hear Commissioner Barnett's comments about the sort of broader economic plan. But I think we need to separate that out from this tasting room issue. I think we do need a diversity of businesses, and it is healthy. But I don't think limiting the number of tasting rooms or regulating tasting rooms is going to solve that larger economic issue. We need to figure out how are we going to attract those diversified mixes of businesses, and how do we capitalize on what is already our primary strength. We've been an agricultural and tourist-based economy for over 100 years. That is our strength, and we need to figure out how we sort of build on that as an economic base. And also, all the data you read about, the sort of changes in people's spending habits, whether it's the desires of millennials or the fact that boomers have sort of been through their entire acquisitive years, that the economy is much more experience-based than it used to be. It's not object or product-based. So I know I've checked in with some commercial real estate brokers in the area and said, we see signs, things are for lease, and who wants to lease this space? And it's nobody with cute little shops. that wants to lease the space on the plaza. It's people that have wine and food-related businesses. Those are the people that want to be on our plaza, because that, to me, is the essence of what our economy is about. We're not about, you know, cute little stores on the plaza. So that's kind of my meta view. To now address the topics on the screen here with the issue, the block face thing, and that to me fits in a more traditional grid type downtown situation. But you know, I think our downtown situation is unique in that our downtown is built around a really large plaza. I think it's the largest, maybe the second largest in the state. Largest, yeah. And so we're not divided up into a little block, like a block-like grid. And so I think using that kind of notion would be an artificial construct for us. Size limits, I think, might be some indicator of some trigger point in the, I think the staff report said the average size is about 1,500 square feet. So maybe there's a more restrictive above and a less restrictive below what the average is in terms of defining, you know, what might be a large-scale operation. On the numeric limits, I would absolutely oppose that. In fact, I would challenge any of my fellow commissioners who have come out in favor of that to then tell me, what are the numeric limits on the number of restaurants? What are the numeric limits on the number of women's clothing stores? What's the numeric limits on the number of banks? What are the numeric limits on any type of business? Are we so finely engineering our local economy that we can define numeric limits for any type of business? So we can pick out this one type of business and say, oh, well, here's the number we need. This is the ideal number. This is the operationally efficient number. I don't think we can do that as a government body. So I don't think we should pursue that path at all. Geographically, I think this whole issue, as it came out originally with the whole idea of too many real estate offices, which is, I remember very vividly around the time that my wife and I opened our business here, was the hot button issue. And that's what created the plaza overlay districts, retail overlay districts. So I think we should limit our discussion to that. And then on the sourcing, it's farming. It's a nice idea to aspire to. You want it as local and direct as possible, and I think through a lot of other things you can get towards that. But to come up with any kind of formula that tells a winery they have to have this percentage of grapes from here or there, that might be true one year and it might not be true the next year. Maybe they lose a contract, or maybe phylloxera wipes out a vineyard that they source from and they have to go somewhere else. So the notion of maybe having as a ideal that it's somehow tied to promoting our local economy and our local agriculture is good, but I think it's a slippery slope to go down the whole idea of sourcing, given that at the base of this we're talking about farmers that have been farming here for years and know what can happen from year to year in terms of those things. So I think my bottom line is whatever we decide to do about regulating tasting rooms is not going to solve what the real root issue is, and that's creating a diverse and vibrant economy, because those issues are not a problem created by tasting rooms. Those issues are created by much larger economic forces that are at work, big box stores, e-commerce, all of those things, a change in consumer behavior patterns. That's what's driving the overall change. That's why we don't have a pharmacy on the plaza anymore. That's why we don't have a hardware store on the plaza anymore. It's not because of tasting rooms. So yes, we can look at tasting rooms and we can make some regulations about that, but to Commissioner Barnett's point and David, I'm glad to hear that that's going to be part of the general plan. It's that larger economic driving issue that's going to really, if there is something, as was said, was out of whack with the plaza, it's not going to be fixed by regulating tasting rooms. It's going to be fixed by a much broader view, and that's just my input on that. Thank you.
First of all, I used to work for the Sonoma Valley Vintners and Growers back in the early 90s, and I made a proposal that we put an educational vineyard on the plaza. So I'm for wineries, and that's who we are. And I think wine tasting is an exceptional marketing tool for our local wineries. But having said that, I have said it many, many times, and I agree that we need an economic development plan, and that will help guide and shape us. But I do believe we need to do something in the interim. And part of my concern is presently, when I read in a staff, I think it was a memo, that there's no way to know when a new wine tasting facility is coming in unless it's the business license that flags it. So, and having a business license myself, not everybody's right on top of all of that. So there's no way to know. So I do believe there needs to be some type of regulation. I agree with Commissioner Barnett that I would like to see maybe a more creative way of regulating it, but I would be in favor of the use permit. But I would like to see something more. And I would like to see us buy some time to really delve into this wholeheartedly and go through each one of these options and really discuss the pros and cons of all of them to some great detail. I do favor the numeric limit for now, especially as a way to curtail the expansion at this point until we do have an economic development plan that tells us what a healthy state of economy will yield for us. I do like the grape sourcing requirement, and if there is a use permit required, I would like to see grandfathered in that the first people that get it are the ones that have a local sourcing aspect to it. And I do think that we need to curtail it to the plaza retail overlay zone, as Commissioner Cribbs said. So I'm not in favor of the space limit. I think we need to be careful not to be too restrictive, but to care for the overall concern and the totality of what is happening on our plaza. And I do think that this needs to have a really detailed look at it. So I would go with either the extended moratorium or I like the numeric limit and then relook the issue in the future with the use permit. And I think that is going to keep things down for now. So that's basically, and I like the 20% as a numeric limit. I think where we're at right now is pretty good.
Yes, I have a number of comments. First of all, in the broad scheme of things, to me, if we even took the less restrictive options on all of them, okay, it's a lot of overregulation for something that, from my perspective, I do not see as a major issue. That being said, I wasn't here for all the discussion that went into this, and I'm quite sure, given the memorandums that I've read in the staff report, that there must have been an awful lot of discussion about it. I think that government can't chase markets easily, okay? And so we're chasing a market here that probably will take care of itself in the long term. That being said, okay, I would have no problem with a use permit requirement for those outside of the retail overlay zone, okay? except for the fact that it's going to create problems for existing wine tasting facilities, some of which have been really long-term here in the city and have been around for a long period of time and may have applications that are very minor, like for outdoor seating or for any other kind of thing that they want to change that would be affected by that use permit requirement. I like the idea that Commissioner Barnett talked about of having a special license requirement, okay, with perhaps a tripper clause that says where staff is uncomfortable with that, that it could require a use permit instead of just a special licensing. I do not favor any kind of increase on the moratorium. I think that we've had so much information, and I recognize that I'm late in the game on this, but a lot of information on this, that we should not continue this kind of restriction long-term. I think, you know, we have enough, right? So in terms of, let me just say, I think that the location restrictions, I do not support. I do not support tenant space size limitations. We don't know what size works for a particular building or anything else. I do not support numeric limits. We don't know how many is right and how many is wrong, okay? And nobody knows that. I'm talking about probably any member of the commission or member of staff, okay? The geographic scope, I think that the retail overlay zone is the most important, obviously, okay? But there could be real applications outside of the retail overlay zone that could be potentially problematic, and that's why I'm talking about some kind of tripper clause, okay? And the grape sourcing requirement, I believe, is totally unenforceable. And it would just result in a lot of staff time doing something that I don't think, with the size of the staff that we have in Sonoma, is prepared easily to do. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Let me just begin by saying I certainly want to see a diversified set of businesses, particularly around the plaza. So I would like to come up with things that we do that, while they aren't overly restrictive for a certain type of business, that I think that some regulation is required, and there are certain things that come to light over the last few years. We've had more than a doubling of tasting rooms, and we have absolutely no control over that as long as there's not a use permit requirement, because they can just appear on the scene, and when they get a business license, they're there. And that, yes, we do want to promote local farmers. We do want to support family businesses, but with the situation we have right now, if a large corporation wants to come in to the plaza and they can pay the rent, there's no local sourcing, there's no local agriculture, there's no local family business guaranteed in that. So we have absolutely no control over that at this point. So I am definitely in favor of a use permit so that we can take an application at a time, so that we can see who intends to come in. I would further say that if we are really trying to promote the family-owned business and we are trying to promote the local agriculture, that I would, maybe we don't call it a sourcing requirement, but I would certainly like to have some findings in effect that would favor that type of a business and favor that type of an economy, as opposed to the large commercial conglomerate that wants to come in and take over the town. I think we should be trying to do it right, and if that means that we can't get it right by the end of September for a moratorium, then I would like to extend that moratorium, or as has been said here, maybe we create some artificial limits for the time being, so that we have time to get the economic plan in place. We have time to assess what kind of a mix is appropriate for the plaza. But one way or the other, either to extend the moratorium or to put some artificial limits in place, I think is called for at this point. I think the emphasis needs to be on the plaza overlay zone, but I would like to see some regulation citywide, just because I think that it goes beyond what happens on the plaza, and that I think we should be cognizant of what we are trying to promote for business in the entire city of Sonoma. We're not that big a city, and if we're trying to keep the flavor of a small town that's got a historic feel to it, I think we should have some control over what we allow for business. So I think we've had a reasonable amount of consensus with some of the concepts that have been discussed tonight. There are certainly individual views as well, but I'm hoping that there's enough direction there to take something forward to the council.
I feel there is. Yeah, I think we've got some great comments, and I think that you've given the council a lot of good ideas to work with.
Through the chair, I do have one more comment. It has to do with either a zoning standard or a performance standard as it relates to this type of use. The parking requirements and the exclusion of outdoor seating from any sort of parking requirement. I think that is a trigger for me. I think that's something that we all as a commission should look at and make recommendations to the council. Particularly the fact that tasting room is unique. It's not like a retail experience where somebody goes in and tries a dress on, or gets a Slurpee or whatever and leaves. This is a long, sometimes a long time extension and process and experience, and almost like a restaurant when you think about the time that sometimes people will stay like 1 hour in a tasting. Then also you've got outdoor seating where people are experiencing wine, taking their time, and then there's other folks that are purchasing wine. So I think that we really should, as a commission, kind of think a little bit more about that, where we have shared uses in the overlay district, where we've got more parking available. I know people are going to look at me and say, what parking? But then you have other commercial areas along Broadway and other commercial areas where we theoretically could also have tasting rooms where there is limited parking, and there's also impacts associated with adjoining uses, outdoor activities, people staying long nights. More almost looked at to me as it could be a restaurant, and so we require use permits for restaurants. We would have special parking requirements for restaurants, and I think we should be treating tasting rooms similarly.
And I think that goes along with having some control, like a use permit, to examine things like parking, so that we can deal with those issues. So I think we're going to leave it at that then, if that's agreeable.
Should we take like a straw poll on all these things, or?
I'm not exactly in favor of doing that, unless you feel that you don't have a reasonable amount of consensus.
Well, again, it's up to the commission. Speaking as a staff person, like I say, I feel like you've given the city council a lot of good ideas to work with. I think that there are some areas of commonality, and that those are going to be pretty clear, but as far as that goes, it's up to you.
I just want to then, at least with my comments, I want to emphasize that I support a numeric limit below the current number of tasting rooms, not because, to Commissioner Cribb's point, I know what that limit is. It's because it gives us more time to incorporate the economic development analysis and really come up with a good plan here. Because I do think that while they're separate issues, economic development and tasting rooms, they're also intertwined. I think when you reference the jewelry store that moved to the marketplace off the plaza, they, from what I understand, and from what I understand about other businesses on the plaza, like the art studio behind there, they're moving because the rents are going way up. And the rents are going way up because there are, from what I understand, large wineries or small wineries, but wineries that are willing to pay those rents because for some of these small producers, that's their only outlay. They don't own land. In a way, to an earlier conversation we had, it's like a billboard. Like, they don't have to make money in that tasting room. It's a marketing expense. And so in a way, that distorts the market. And so if we had a normal functioning market, I wouldn't want regulations either. But we have a sort of distorted market that I don't know enough about, which is why I want an economic development analysis, which is why I, in this case, not always, but support a lower numeric limit to buy us time if they're not willing to extend the moratorium.
And I do think we have a majority of the commission that is leaning that direction, so I don't know that a straw poll per se is necessary, but those are very valid points, Commissioner Burnett. So with that, I think we're going to conclude this item. And we'll move on to item 7.2, which is the review, discussion, and direction regarding the definition of coverage in the development code. With that, and before we do that, I think we're going to take a very short recess of 3 minutes. Call the meeting back to order. So, Planning
All right,
Director.
I should have, I basically must apologize because I had a miscommunication with the city attorney's office. On this next item, which is item number 7.3, 7.2, excuse me. As staff, I really need to do a better job of coming up with a set of structured recommendations for the Planning Commission. We don't want to just, you know, drive off a cliff or just go places that we don't want to end up going. And so at your, with your permission, I would just like to postpone this item to your regular meeting in July. It's an important topic of discussion, but we want to make sure that you have all of the information and the tools that you need to get it right and achieve a good outcome. And I don't think that we're there yet with the staff report, so I apologize for that.
Unless anybody from the commission has a problem with that, I would like to just, and you don't need a motion on that then, we're just a discussion item. All right. We will move on to item 7.3 then. The review, discussion, and direction regarding opportunities for public comment with respect to projects involving negative declarations, environmental impact reports. So with that, I will have a staff report, please.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the commission. So just by way of background, and this isn't anything that's unfamiliar to you, but when an application is before the Planning Commission for consideration of approval, and that consideration includes a decision point as to whether or not to adopt a negative declaration or an environmental impact report, the Planning Commission technically is taking two separate actions. One would be the adoption or certification of the environmental review, and the other would be the approval or denial, as the case may be, of the project entitlements, those being a use permit, a tentative map, or whatever. And a good example of that is the recent review of the Gateway project at 870 Broadway. During that discussion, during the public hearing, the issue was raised as to whether there should be additional opportunity for public comment in order to ensure an opportunity for comment on the part of the public, addressing both the environmental review documents and the project. The Planning Commission asked that this issue, since it's larger than any one project, be placed on a subsequent agenda for discussion. And in looking at this matter, in staff's view, there are three options for expanding the opportunity for public comment. One would be to hold separate hearings on separate dates. Under this option, the hearing on the environmental review would occur at one meeting, and assuming adoption or certification, the hearing on the project would be held at a separate subsequent meeting. This option creates a number of problems. First, members of the public do not necessarily distinguish between environmental review issues and project issues. Second, once an environmental review has been completed, there are state-mandated permanent streamlining procedures that require action on the project within fixed deadlines. And if those deadlines aren't met, the project could be deemed approved by default. Excuse me. And third, members of the public who are interested in the project are required to attend 2 meetings. Fourth, this process makes it difficult for the Planning Commission to alter a project in order to reduce environmental impacts. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. And the Gateway project offers us an example. So when this project was brought before you at its first public hearing, there was an issue with a portion of one of the buildings being located within a floodway. And there were different options for correcting that problem, including just moving the building. But it's easier to have that discussion when the Planning Commission can talk about both the environmental review and the project at the same time. Because if you approve the environmental review, you are locking yourself into those mitigation measures. Well, those mitigation measures, if you decide to simply move the building out of the floodway, might be totally different than a decision to, say, for example, require engineering certification. So you run into some potential pitfalls in that area if you deny yourselves the chance to discuss the project and the environmental review simultaneously. A second option would be to hold separate hearings on the same date. So here we have one meeting date, but 2 separate public hearings, one on the environmental review and one on the project. And this option 2 has some downsides. The meeting would be lengthened, there would be 2 staff reports and a certain amount of redundancy. Again, members of the public do not necessarily distinguish between environmental review issues and project issues, with the likely result that there would be redundant comments as well over the course of the 2 hearings. And as is the case with option 1, this process would make it difficult for the Planning Commission to alter a project in order to reduce environmental impacts in a efficient manner. And then a third option would be to lengthen the public comment time limit. Currently, the practice is to limit public comments to 3 minutes. Under this option, the time limit would be extended, perhaps to 4 to 5 minutes. This option has the benefit of allowing members of the public to speak on either environmental issues, project issues, or both without constraint, and it avoids the negative consequences associated with options 1 and 2. So to the extent that there's interest in expanding the opportunity for public comment with respect to projects involving negative declarations and environmental impact reports, and that's certainly a legitimate objective, staff would recommend option 3. And I don't know if the city attorney has anything to add to this yet, or?
Not yet.
Okay.
Okay, questions of staff?
I have a few questions. The first is, under option 1, you mentioned state mandated permits, streamlining procedures. To what types of projects do those apply, and what is the amount of time?
So the answer is all discretionary projects, and secondarily, the answer is it depends on what the environmental review was as to what the amount of time is. I don't have the State Permit Streamlining Act in front of me, but.
This isn't the recent changes
Nope.
where it applies to
No.
expedite residential, it's all types?
No, although those have an effect as well.
Mhm.
I certainly, it isn't generally considered a best practice to separate the two, because the time period with which the Permanent Streamlining Act comes into effect only comes into effect after environmental review is certified. So here's an egregious example, but I'll give you one, because I had it happen once. We had a situation where environmental review was complete, certified as part of an action, separated from the land use entitlement itself. The land use entitlement itself was subsequently denied. So you had approved environmental review, but when they got to the actual action on the project itself, it was denied. Developer number 1 decides not to pursue. So it sits there with this approved environmental document,
Right.
and then this project goes away. A revised project comes in with a subsequent purchaser who is buying a land with a approved environmental document on it. Proposes some tweaks to the project, enough that it requires a fair amount of review by staff, but is proposing to use the pre-existing environmental document. Well, we have all kinds of problems with that scenario, as you can well imagine, including now we're stuck with some fast timelines to review a project that frankly staff has just now for the first time seen. So it can get very, very awkward when you separate them.
If the commission wanted to separate them, which I don't even know if I want to, I'm just asking, could it be a situation where that first meeting was the environmental hearing, and then you don't take action, and then you have a second meeting where you at the beginning take action right away and then have the use permit? So you continue the environmental hearing to the second meeting?
You could hold a hearing, not take action on the environmental document, and then hold the second hearing, and it avoids some of the problems. It doesn't avoid all of them. I mean, I suppose another option that isn't here in front of staff is you could decide to add a hearing, which hearing you held when the environmental document was in draft form, as opposed to the final environmental document for adoption. Because one of the things that does is gives you the opportunity to alter the environmental document before such time as it becomes the final environmental document. Not as easy with negative declarations that don't get reviewed in draft form, but certainly that could work for a complicated project like an EIR, where you're looking at holding a hearing when it's in draft form before you go to final, let the public talk to you about it, give some direction about what you'd like to see changed, if anything, before the document goes to final. That's an option sometimes.
But you can actually exercise that option
On a case-by-case basis.
on a case-by-case basis, no matter what. You've advertised the public hearing for the environmental review in the project. You hold your public hearing. You decide you want to make alterations in the environmental review. That's what you do.
Right. And so you don't even get to the use permit in that hearing.
Right. Right, but you don't have to go in trying to notice two different meetings, which has its own set of just logistical issues.
And then my final question is, what has been our practice historically for the city, and then what do other cities do? I mean, is this a, and that's just my question. I mean, is it typical that it's done this way? Is it typical to split them?
I'll let David answer the first question, which is what has this city historically done, because I don't know if it's ever been any different than it has been more recently. I've worked for over 20 cities in this state. None of the cities that I've previously worked for split them. They hold the hearings together. No. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's more typical that it be held together.
And just, I just wanted to answer the question in terms of local practice. The local practice is to hold consolidated public hearings, but at the same time, depending on the length of the hearing, the issues that arise, things can go in different directions. You could very well get a direction, no, we're not ready to certify this, or we might want changes or whatever. But I can only think of one time when we basically did that on purpose, and that was many years ago.
Oh, sorry. One thing that I think might be of some interest to add is that in another jurisdiction that we represent, when we adopted a new comprehensive, theirs is called a zoning code, but development code, we actually instituted what I shorthand refer to as the keep together provision. So the code actually has a requirement that says all related land use entitlements and the environmental documents stay together regardless, and that if one is appealed, they all go up on appeal. And the reason for that was that in one instance there was a situation, again, where we had multiple land use entitlements, only one thing got appealed, but unfortunately the thing that got appealed wasn't the thing that the council wanted to change on appeal. And then they were sort of stuck. They didn't have jurisdiction over the other entitlement. They didn't have jurisdiction over the environmental document. It hadn't been appealed. They had jurisdiction over, I don't remember what it was, a use permit as opposed to a subdivision that wasn't what they wanted to alter. So we instituted a provision that said everything stays together so that you have the full breadth of all of your options before you on appeal. It becomes a little more complicated to do that when you split the hearing up, at least as respects decision. And your point of, well, could every hearing be 2 hearings with the decision only taking place on the last one is a different question.
Even if we have a single hearing, we would have a motion on the environmental impact report or the negative declaration prior to a motion on the use permit. So you have 2 separate motions regardless.
Always true that it's 2 separate actions or 2 separate motions regardless. I agree with that statement. It's just that if you're inviting them to occur on 2 different dates, that separation sometimes does not give you the maximum flexibility.
I'd just like to just interject in terms of this specific discussion, having hearings versus having public notices for solicitation of comments. When a project is being evaluated for its completeness, and then staff has to make a decision whether the project is deemed complete, some cities do then post a notice on the property saying, soliciting comments for the environmental review, where before the project even is going to, before hearing, a notice is posted on the property saying, we are reviewing, we have determined that a negative declaration or an EIR is going to be required. We are soliciting comments for 21 days. this gives people the ability to then write their letters before the project even gets to the point where a staff report is written. In some instances, some cities have zoning boards. They have a zoning administrator and a planning commission. Some projects, and when we get farther on down the road, I'm hoping that our city might look at a two-part system where we have a zoning administration board and a zoning, that things could be approved at a zoning administrator level and appeal to the planning commission. That could eliminate a lot of the things that we review, but subsequently, an environmental review that's noticed, those comments can be reviewed at a zoning administrator board as opposed to a planning commission to then assemble the final documents for environmental review. So in a kind of a roundabout way, there's ways to be able to get public comments on an environmental review that doesn't necessarily have to require a public hearing with the planning commission. And these are like bigger picture things and more procedural and administrative proceedings that the council would want to weigh in on to be able to create more public input with respect to environmental review. And that seems to be the big burden that we carry at a lot of these meetings, is that people get bogged down on the environmental review. And if we flesh these things out in advance, sometimes there's an advantage to that.
I guess I would comment that the earlier you can encourage comment on the environmental portion, it's always the better. So whether that's by establishing a process that encourages people to come before somebody to comment, or whether it's a process that increases the way you notice it or what have you, late environmental comments actually create a lot of delay in the loop, right? Because you're going back to fix something, or you're, that's always a problem. And a lot of times the public doesn't feel like they have the information necessary on their part to comment intelligently about the project itself when they feel the environmental document is inadequate and they don't have enough information to know, well, what really will be the impact at this intersection you didn't study or whatever. I'm just using that as an example, but so yes, you're right. Whatever we could do from a process perspective to bring the comment from the environmental document early in the process is frankly sometimes a streamlining of the process.
I have a comment.
Okay.
Well, we want to.
I'm sorry.
No, I defer to the chair.
I have a question on trying to do things in a single meeting. If it's only one public hearing, why can't there be a separate staff report for the environmental portion, at which time you can ask for questions, go out to public comment, and then come back and have a staff report just on the use permit and have its separate discussion? You have flexibility within that same hearing, within that same meeting. If something comes up in the use permit discussion, where you can go back and reconsider the previous motion.
Okay. I would say that there's no, legal impediment to doing that. That's just a matter of process. If you were going to do that process, then I would still suggest that that all of the actions be consolidated at the end. In other words, there's two opportunities for public comment, two staff reports, but there's one set of commission actions at the conclusion of all of that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. No, I could go for that. I mean, I'm looking for a way, because it just seems that when it's all presented in one staff report and in one set of public comments, the two things get all mixed up. And yes, some people can't keep it straight, but it's up to us as a commission, myself as a chair, yourself as staff, to try to make sure that it stays on the straight and narrow for the thing that's being discussed.
Well, I agree with that. But I would just, and again, there's absolutely nothing to prevent you from instituting that as a practice, and maybe it's something that we could experiment with. But to your point about, managing public comment and keeping people on track, that takes time too. And if someone gets up in the environmental review section of the public comment period and they get up and they say, I hate this project, or I love this project, I would be hard pressed to say that they shouldn't say that during the environmental review. But even if I did, then that kind of management, if you will, also has kind of an overhead in terms of the time it takes to get through the meeting, and you avoid that overhead if you structure it so that people can talk about whatever is on their mind, whether it's an environmental issue or a project issue or both.
I think the other thing that happens it's just human nature. Folks get to the front of the line and they don't want to wait for everybody else to comment on so under that scenario, environmental document, to have to then come back to comment on the project. So policing people would be tough, because I think they're going to be, a lot of people will be resistant to, well, now I have to sit down and then wait while everyone else comments on environmental and then stand up again and talk about the project itself. I did have a recent, it's not that recent now, but a couple years ago, a circumstance where, because a project was on a site that was a contaminated site, there was a requirement that the project go through a process to do a use permit to clean the site first before they could even process an application to change the land use on the site. So legally required that they actually, because of a deed restriction, process a piece of it first. And we could not get the public to not talk about the piece that wasn't in front of the Planning Commission. They wanted to talk about literally wasn't even in front of them, because the permit to actually allow it to be a residential site couldn't be considered until the site was cleaned to a residential standard. And we literally could not get the public to not talk about what they liked or didn't like about the residential project that wasn't even in front of the commission. So sometimes it's hard to get folks to just comment on one thing.
But be that as it may, the suggestion that you just raised, it's a perfectly viable, doable thing, and you can, it's something that we can experiment with too. You can try it and see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm going to entertain another question here, but then I want to go out to the public, because I want to hear public comment before we continue this discussion, because I'm sure we've got some interesting point of view out there too. So go ahead.
So this is a little out of the box, and it would require management, but it could manage. The most important thing is to give the people an opportunity to speak. I agree that there's muddled lines. What about, could we, and I saw this up at the supervisors, could we not have them pre-question on cards, and then somebody very carefully sorts them out in a timely manner, and then those questions or comments on environmental review get pulled and called forward, and then the questions on the use permit get pulled and called forward, and then it's managed. We could. Okay.
Legally you can.
Okay.
I think I'm going to go out to public comment then.
I want to go first. Patricia Cullinan, 425 Denmark. So as a person who has had to read environmental reports or initial studies or negative decks, over my weekend when I had plans and I'm working, I like the idea of anything environmental, at least having more time for the public to look at, because that's the hard thing. David knows that sometimes at 3:30 or 4 o'clock, there's a letter that comes by email from me, because I haven't had time before the meeting to spend to read the information and make comments. And so I think it's really important to, I understand the idea of keeping them together for the decision-making process, but for the public comment, they've just got to be separate. They come out on Friday, and so, you know, I'm working Friday, so maybe Saturday morning. I mean, it's brutal. My favorite was the cheese factory. I was ready to scream at somebody just because, you know, it's so much work for a private citizen. There's no money involved here. I'm not making money off of this. So that's my biggest comment. I'm sure Bill has some more articulate comments, but you know, too many times it's just been it's unfair to the people who want to comment. That's it.
Bill Willers, 873 First Street West. You know, the primary purpose of CEQA is to bring information to the public and to the decision makers about the potential environmental impact of a project. And a decision-making body is not supposed to make a decision on a project until they have satisfied the conditions of CEQA. How many of you have had CEQA training? Do you know what it really, you know what it really mandates? It mandates that you understand that you've satisfied the environmental impact of a project, and you've satisfied it in a way that you've reduced the potential impacts of a project, potential significant impacts of a project, to less than significant. And those can be a whole variety of impacts, and they can have substantial consequence on the way in which a project is formed and shaped and decided upon being approved in the future. The problem with joining the two elements together is that it is human nature to talk about the project. The Commission as a body has done this several times with projects that have had environmental review and project review combined in the meeting. You have actually made comments and decisions, essentially, in your comments about projects before you even, or if you even did, discuss the environmental impacts of a project, and made essentially action on those environmental documents, what CEQA requires you to do. CEQA requires you to make that environmental action before reviewing or considering a project. That's your responsibility. So for the public's review, for the public's opportunity to present their point of view to you as a body who's making the decision on a project, it's only fair to the public to be allowed to, one, address the environmental impacts, and the body then make a decision whether those are valid, so then they may have consequence on the project, and then that will inform the decision-making body whether or not there needs to be revision to the project to address those things. Then when the project is ready to be discussed, that same person or other people in the community may have comments about use permit issues and development code issues and local issues related to that project. Those two things don't always go together. A lot of times they overlap, especially in our community, which is a historic community that has significant visual assets that can be impacted by projects. The clarity only helps the public. It helps the city council in the future, and it definitely helps you as a decision-making body. And that's what this process is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to expedite use permits. The Permit Streamline Act has been in place since 1977, and no jurisdiction is going out and losing projects and having them, you know, an applicant has to file a court proxy to inform a city that they're going to enforce the Permit Streamline Act on their project. You'll know about that because staff will bring that in front of you and say it's a problem. We got to do something about this. So, you know, please consider this in that light. There is no harm in information, there's no harm in data, and there's no harm in deliberation in front of this body, it may take an extra meeting. I sat through 15 years of meetings on one project. So I know all about it.
Thanks, Bill. If there's no other public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission. I would like to take some of this into account to figure out if we can do it in a, you know, I'm willing as chair to take on trying to police two sets of comments from the public. Whether they, and if we could do that in a structured form so that we get a staff report that addresses the environmental review prior to the staff report that addresses the project, and have public comment after the first and after the second, and maybe take no action, as you say, until we know that both pieces fit. And if we have to do that in one meeting, we always have the ability, if the environmental review goes too long, we can continue it.
Well, that,
And it
again,
can go to
that
a
can
second
always
meeting.
happen
I know.
anyway, and has, so, yeah.
But I would somehow like to break the two apart. I'm reluctant to have a person come up there and have 5 or 6 or 8 minutes or whatever to ramble on about whatever they want to ramble on about. If you try to convince them that they're supposed to be talking about environmental review and you give them 3 minutes to do it, they might come close to matching that, and vice versa for the project itself. But if you just give them carte blanche to talk about anything they want, I think we're asking for trouble in a different form.
Well, again, as long as the decision-making phase is consolidated, I think that addresses many of the concerns that staff had about breaking them apart. And so we're happy to experiment with that approach. And, you know, I don't know what the next issue that comes up is going to be that requires a negative declaration or an environmental impact report, but I'll consult with you, the chair, in advance of that to, you know, assuming that this is a direction the commission wants to go in, to set that up, and we'll give it a try.
I mean, I've been making a lot of comments here. I'd like to hear from the rest of the commission on that. Maybe I'm the only one that feels this way, but I've gone through this process for a lot of times, and it's always seemed to be, even though we were supposed to make sure the environmental review took place first, that the commission itself would drift off into the project too early. And I would like to separate the two as much as we can, just to have a focused discussion.
I think it's going to be very difficult for you or any future chair to monitor public comment. I know Chair Cribb tried to do that during the FSE project purposely for one meeting, and it didn't work.
If I may, I think that is a very difficult thing to do, to get the public to separate in their minds the environmental issues from the project issues.
Well, was there a staff report that had the entire project discussed, though? Was it environmental plus
Basically.
project?
Well, in fact, the only item on the agenda was the environmental review.
I know, but well, that's my point.
And it was still hard.
And but what I would suggest, because I think it will be very difficult, and I mean, if you want to, that's fine. But to police the public, what I would recommend, if you're going to police anybody, is us, and require commissioners to only talk about environmental, period, and then require, because we should know what the difference between CEQA and use permit issues, hopefully, most of us do, and then use permit. I mean, I think if you're going to monitor anybody, or we could do 2 meetings. I mean, there are other options here, but if you're going to do 1 meeting monitor, I think you should monitor the commissioners. Because, for example, we've all brought up different anecdotes. I don't know if I'm allowed to bring this up, but let's say there's a large multi-tenant retail establishment on the on the plaza, proposed to be redeveloped, we had to approve the environmental report first before we even got to a use permit. And in the view of some, there was elements of that environmental review that were lacking, whether it was traffic, et cetera. You know, we've been through this. But everyone couldn't talk about how they were excited they were to go to a butcher shop, you know? And there were two separate issues. And so in my view, I see benefit to either two meetings, but I'm open to the fact that that could create more problems, unintended consequences. So if we're going to have one meeting, I would just want to, it's going to be tough to monitor the public, so I would just want you or any future chair to potentially monitor our discussions.
Well, I would say too that in terms of monitoring the public, you've got the same problem if you have two meetings. You have exactly the same problem. So, two meetings doesn't, in my view, to the extent that that's an issue, having two meetings doesn't solve that problem. That was my only comment.
And that's where I'm coming with on the time limit too. I feel you have much more control if you can cut them off at 3 minutes than to give them 6 minutes. Because you can suggest that they hold that thought until we get to the next phase. If they resist, at least you have a limited time, and maybe the next person that gets up will realize that, hey, they're supposed to be talking about one thing, not the other. I'd be willing to give it a try. I don't know if anybody wants to suffer through that with me.
What I was also going to say is, because I know it's not going to fix what David was saying in terms of the public, but I'm also not against two meetings. I mean, I know that there are unintended consequences with that, but if that's what the commission wants to do, I mean, generally a environmental review is required for a certain level of project, which strikes me as a project that we need to get right, and that's going to stand the test of time. So if it does take one more meeting, I'm not against that.
But I think, given my scenario, I think we have the opportunity to force another meeting. If we get into the first part of the discussion with environmental review, you get comments, you bring it back, and then you realize, hey, it's not, we can't take action on it.
We're not done with this.
We're not done on it. Then you continue it.
Yeah.
Right there, and you force a second meeting.
That, as a staff person, I have to say would be my strong preference, because it gives you flexibility. You can have a second meeting if you need one. It's not like that's never happened. That happens frequently. But at the same time, it just makes the logistics of setting up the meetings in the first place much easier. And, not to sound like I'm overly concerned about expediting the process. That is an issue. Just establishing these meetings can be cumbersome and time consuming, and if we can set one meeting date, we can always continue it and extend it if we need to. But
you don't see any major problem with splitting out a staff report into two parts, do you?
No, I don't.
Because, I mean, that sort of has to happen anyway.
Can I just say that I think that it would be enormously difficult for any member of the public, including the Planning Commission, to separate the two issues every time. However, I also believe, and it would be so time consumptive to have two separate meetings. I think that has more implications on the public and the applicants than it does even on all of us. And the reason is that it just means that everybody has to come back again and say something else. So I support the chair's recommendation, is that we just treat it very practically, but not split the hearings unless it's absolutely necessary. And like you say, David, you can do that at any time. And with maybe a project that is extremely controversial and needs a full environmental impact report or something like that, maybe that's when you can use your discretion and just basically, or who's ever in your place eventually, use the discretion to actually bring it separately before the commission. But otherwise, I think it's very tough to separate them out, other than with, like, the staff reporting that perhaps the chair has suggested, you know.
Well, I think, I mean, it puts a little extra burden on the staff, but I think you can craft a staff report.
It
that
really doesn't.
Really, but I mean, it can really be focused.
There's no staff issue
we
at
have
all.
to trust that we can get that message across. I don't know, I'm looking out there at Mr.
Yeah,
Willis.
I do want to say that just in terms of your suggestion, it doesn't create any extra work for staff at all. It's just a different way of doing things. So there's no issue with that.
I mean, if the commission is willing to try it, while I'm in the hot seat, I'm willing to try it.
If I may, I just want to, having sat in that seat for the hotel project, the Altamira apartment project, the First Street East project, and as Commissioner Barnett always pointed, I just want to, I know members of the public felt like they were not being heard when they were having to be controlled to say, well, we're only talking about environmental issues now. And I think that was even when the staff report was crystal clear. You know, here were the X number of items and these were the topics, and we're not talking, that's what we're talking about. I think you want the public to feel like they can express themselves and they don't have to be monitoring themselves as to, oh, is this an environmental issue or is this a land use issue? They just see it all as one thing. You know, they're building a hotel here, they're going to put a house here, they're going to build an apartment here, and they have different issues that they want to talk about. So I think regardless of how staff structures the report, that's how people are going to come in and respond. And I think the issue that I felt that occurred on the 870 Broadway was that, well, I want to talk about these two different things, but you're not giving me enough time. You're only giving me this small, limited amount of time when there's broader issues to talk about. So I'd rather listen to someone ramble for 5 or 6 minutes about, you know, the traffic problem, or they don't like the trees, or whatever, and then, to Commissioner Barnett's point, have you be the police force for those of us sitting on the dais, rather than be the police force and try, because I don't think there's anything that we can do. I don't think any amount of instruction or whatever is going to stop members from the public of crossing the lines, regardless of how the staff report is written, how much it's separated out. And I mean, if you want to try it, it's just, I want to come from a place where
I've said,
feel like they have a chance
I've
to
been in
express
this
themselves. Yeah.
chair, this is my 3rd time.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, granted, you've had some tough projects in the recent past, but I think that I've had a reasonably good record of not alienating the public in the times that I've been chair. And I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I do think that I've gotten enough favorable comment on how I conduct myself that I'm willing to make an attempt at it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
And I just kind of want to piggyback on that, and I guess maybe bring up what I already brought up before. It has to do with getting or soliciting comments about the environmental review up front, and looking at the administrative procedures and noticing to see if there's a way that up front we can resolve issues, so when it does get to the planning commission, the environmental issues or the supposed adequacy of the document has been better vetted. And I'm not suggesting like some counties or very large cities like Los Angeles has an environmental review commission. I mean, there's a commission that reviews the environmental documents and the adequacy of the documents, especially if there's an EIR. Sometimes some commissioners sit on that environmental review commission. Sometimes they're separate, but I mean, there's a whole bunch of administrative ways to be able to vet
Well,
it. And I'm not saying we're Los Angeles County.
But I've got another suggestion here. We've tried to put some constraints on when we get the materials before a meeting with some kind of deadline or drop dead date. And I would suggest that if we have a project coming before us with either an EIR or an initial study, mitigated negative declaration, that get issued with a longer time span prior to the rest of the staff report, just so that the public has more time to comment on it and to review it.
Well,
Because
just-
typically those are done sooner,
well,
aren't they?
and yes, that's a fact. So let's take the example of the Gateway project that was posted to the city's website more than 20 days in advance of that meeting. The Planning Commission didn't even take an action at that first meeting. It was, you took public comment, but you didn't take an action, and it was continued to a subsequent meeting. So what's that, 40 days at least to review that document was available. With an EIR, the time periods are even longer. So
Well, I'm just saying, if we make every effort to have a sufficient time period to give more than a weekend before the meeting for a review of a more complex document, that would be appreciated as well.
agreed.
Is there any further discussion on this?
We'll
Not
give it a
really.
try.
Okay, let's go to issues update.
Well, I've given you a written issues update for a change, so I'm glad to be back doing that. There's really, I think there's at least two other things that I wanted to mention, one of which was just brought up under the public comment opportunity at the beginning of this meeting, and that is to just acknowledge the efforts of the Blue Wing Adobe Trust in stepping up and making a great effort to acquire and protect the Casa Ignacio farm, and so I really appreciate the efforts of the trust. And I'm not that familiar with them, but just in looking at the grant application, obviously Patricia Cullinan is the president, Ned Forrest, I know it's been instrumental in the development of that application, and I believe that Commissioner Barnett as well. And I just want to thank and congratulate everyone involved, and I just hope very much that you're able to pull it off, because it would be a fantastic outcome for the community. The second thing I wanted to mention or to talk about a bit is staffing of the planning department. As you know, I'm retiring in early August. The recruiting package has been circulated, and so that application period is open in case anyone's interested. There's a lot of perks that I'd be happy to review with anybody at length. But that said, just given the timing of that going out, it's actually likely that that there will be an interim planning director for possibly up to 2 or 3 months while that recruitment process is completed. So I wanted to let you know that, and we're working to kind of put that together right now. In another staffing issue, which is a good news, bad news. It's bad news for the city, but Rob Yesland resigned to start a private practice. His last day was yesterday. So we are in the process of reaching out to different consultants to bring in some contract planning assistants to help us through a transition period, because it will take some time to recruit and fill that position. So just so you know, we're going to be a little bit thin for a while, but this is a short-term issue. We are bringing in additional assistance. I want to say, too, that when all is said and done and these different processes are completed, there's going to be more resources at the planning department than there ever have been. So I think that the planning department is actually going to come out of this in a stronger position than it has ever been in terms of staff resources. And I also wanted to just add, as a separate matter, this came up relative to a different item on the agenda. In June, we're going back to the city council with different kind of summary proposals related to the council goals, including the general plan update, downtown parking study, Broadway improvements. So those are going to include recommendations for both short-term and long-term actions. We understand that, you know, the council doesn't want to wait around to start getting things done. So that is all in progress, and we actually expect to begin talking to the Planning Commission about the general plan update and possible kind of interim changes to the development code as early as your next regular meeting. So it will take a while for that process to roll out, but we don't want to wait around in terms of getting your input in terms of the issues that need to be addressed and the best way to move forward with it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, David. When you say more resources, what do you mean by that? Do you mean more bodies, or? 'Cause
More
you're pretty
staff
thin.
resources, more,
Bodies.
for better or
Bodies?
worse, I mean, depending on your perspective, more planners.
Oh, well, that's encouraging. That's nice to hear.
David, since we're gonna have an interim planning director for 3 months, did you ever consider just staying on an additional 3 months, or have you already made
Well,
plans?
I've already made just some different personal commitments that
Oh, I see.
would prevent that from happening, but I am also building in some time to be available to help during the transition period.
Because obviously with you and Rob, I mean, it just seems like there might be, you know, some transitional issues. In terms of the new planning director, post-interim, how is that he or she gonna be selected? Is that a city manager decision, a city council decision? Is there gonna be a committee? Like, for example, can our chair be part of the process?
Well,
has any discussion been given to that?
There's two answers to that question. One is, it is a city manager hire, all right? It's the city manager's decision on who to hire. In terms of the process that she is going to use to evaluate candidates, we really have not been able to discuss that yet. Like I say, the recruitment package only just went out the door a couple of days ago.
Other commission comments?
Yep, I've got one. Going back to our earlier discussion, I would like to form a subcommittee in pre-general plan mode to start looking at zoning ordinances and code updates. And I'd like to have this committee meet maybe 2-3 times a month and then report into the Planning Commission.
So before anybody weighs in on that idea, that would have to be something that would come on your agenda for a discussion.
And again, we will be talking about general plan issues at your next regular meeting, so we can talk
Will
about
that be
the
part of
process
that
stuff
agenda
too.
then?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so. No motion. Okay, so next month.
And I'll look for a motion to adjourn then.
I so move.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much.